He says he knows nothing about it, hasn't seen any of these reports. Is that a problem?
Well, I don't know. Maybe he was watching CNN fake news. What do you think?
You don't buy it.
That was a joke.
I know it was a joke. I'm saying you don't buy what he said, obviously.
Aaron?
Yes. I'm sorry, Senator. I'm saying you obviously don't buy what he said. You believe that he has seen these reports. I mean, to your point.
Kevin, I'm not. Are we on?
It looks like we've lost
Okay.
connection with Senator Sanders, so let's just try to get that back up. Do we have him back? Okay, so what we're going to do is take a break.
Liberal or conservative, male or female, young or old, Americans love to bash the news media. Once among the nation's most trusted institutions, the news media have fallen from grace. According to Gallup, even as recently as 2000, a majority of Americans trusted the press. By 2015, it had fallen to 40%, and lower than that, 36% among those 18 to 49. It's hard to see how this decline will be reversed. The industry has become politically polarized, and in the highly competitive age of multiple 24-hour cable news channels and the internet, it's under severe financial pressure. And this compounds an even deeper problem: failing journalistic standards.
The average student graduating from high school in America today knows virtually nothing about the Bill of Rights, their freedoms, or the Constitution. Then there's those few courageous souls or students that occasionally take a stand for their freedoms in schools, and the hammer of censorship drops. All the surveys show that students are practically ignorant not only about their rights, but their government. A recent survey showed that only 2% of the students graduating from high school could name the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The educators don't fare much better. In fact, educators that have some semblance of rights and know that maybe students do have rights don't allow kids to exercise them in the schools. They're very, very reluctant to enforce the Bill of Rights in America's public schools.
When I came to America, the idea of the First Amendment resonated with me hugely and deeply. I'd already encountered censorship, attempts to take work that I'd done off the shelves. I'd watched English customs preventing the importation of American comics and books. And I loved the idea that this was a whole country in which nobody was going to put you in prison, nobody was going to turn around and stop you from talking. That you were in a country in which the remedy for speech you didn't like was either not to listen to it or to speak yourself.
Because scholars and administrators lost faith that there was anything, there was any intrinsic value in studying literature or history or philosophy, and came to believe that the pursuit of social justice, as they defined it, was a far more worthy goal than the pursuit of truth. And the way was paved for the transformation of the university from an institution that was at least ostensibly committed to knowledge to one overtly dedicated to social engineering and correct belief. And you can find evidence for this commitment at any university website and the kinds of things they say to promote themselves. And the result is a totalitarianism not of the jackboot, but of the rainbow flag, the sweetgrass ceremony, and the women-only safe space.
I started watching freedom of speech being taken away. I watched the First Amendment being eroded, and it seemed to me that it was like visiting a place where people had the most valuable, wonderful, perfect thing in the world and just didn't value it, didn't know it was special, didn't know that all around the world you can be put in prison for talking.
It gets worse. The schools often today look like prisons. They have metal detectors, they're surrounded by barbed wire, policemen are walking the hallways, they have zero tolerance policies in effect, which kids are suspended for having Alka-Seltzer, lemon drops, all kinds of weird offenses. In fact, 20 states kids have already been suspended for having Alka-Seltzer. The lesson that's being taught in our schools is that the government, which the schools are government institutions, have absolute power, and they don't really have any rights in the schools. This is students. Abraham Lincoln once said that what's taught in the classroom in one generation is the philosophy of the next. If that's true, then the philosophy being taught our students today is that they're going to live in a totalitarian state where they have no rights.
In the 1950s, the media universe consisted mainly of a few national television broadcast networks and local TV and radio stations, most of which got much of their news from major wire services in the nation's large newspapers. Most journalists were committed to producing objective journalism, fact-based stories independent of the government and of political parties. A reporter's job was to report, not offer opinion or advocate. Presented with the facts, it was up to readers to make their own judgments about news events. Opinions were supposed to be confined to editorial and op-ed pages. That world no longer exists. This lack of objectivity and the decline of standards is one reason, though not the only one, why newspapers and news magazines are a declining industry.
Political correctness is about the dominant belief system, the dominant paradigm dictating what people are allowed to say in order to control what others are allowed to hear. And cultural Marxists really like this whole idea because it does allow them to completely dominate the discourse. Mid-20th century, the term was used disparagingly by equalitarian socialists to refer to dogmatic communists who towed the official Communist Party line over compassion or common sense, and it's since morphed into a description of how governments can establish political control of society and curtail freedom of thought, partly through controlling and manipulating language. Correct words and ideas are extolled, incorrect ones are banned.
The monster of political correctness has taken over our society, and it's really placed its imprint on our schools. Let me give you a few examples. There was a young student named Nicholas Noel a couple years ago at Grand Rapids Union High School that was the valedictorian, asked to give remarks about the school. So when he got up to speak, he was a very nice kid, decided he was going to tell the truth. And very nicely, he just described the schools as prison, his own school as a prison. Of course, the public officials got very upset, and right after he said the word prison, they turned the microphone off. And when he sat down, they told him, "You're not even going to get a diploma now," because they were so upset. This is a very nice kid. And later he said, people asked him, "Why'd you say this?" He said, "Well, the schools push conformity. They want us to all act alike." And he described all these situations that I've already talked about. So he was right. He was just telling the truth, and he got punished.
If you are disagreeing with the dominant or correct attitude or philosophy, you are by definition incorrect. And that incorrectness establishes a moral justification by which you can be ignored or shouted down or otherwise silenced, often by intimidation, often by violence.
According to Pew Research, print revenue from newspaper sales has declined from $47 billion in 2006 to $16 billion in 2014. Digital sales haven't come close to making up the difference. Most papers have been forced to cut operating expenses, slash staff, and close bureaus, overseas in particular. Ironically, there are more stories than ever to cover, and fewer staff than ever to cover them. This lack of information from professional journalists has been filled by a new source: social media and the blogosphere. When the Iraq War, which I covered for the New York Times, began in 2003, there were roughly 100,000 bloggers. Only a few years later, there were an estimated 27 million.
I find it really distressing that the dominant voices on a number of really pressing social and political issues, they seem to see George Orwell's 1984 as not as a warning, but as an instruction manual. And, obviously the nature of power is such that it tries to preserve itself. And, is a really effective way to do that is to silence any challenge to that power. The labels blasphemer, infidel, and heretic of 500 years ago are not that much different in function from misogynist, racist, or even climate change denier today.
the creation of entirely new subjects of study, including women's studies, black studies, queer studies, peace studies, disability studies, and so on, even fat studies apparently. These are declaredly activist programs with little content other than ideology, and they are very dangerous in my opinion. They miseducate students to feel revulsion for their country and to identify themselves as righteous victims allied with the enemies of Western culture and dedicated to its overthrow.
This control used to be administered from governments on down in Stalinist Russia and in Eastern Bloc countries, government mechanisms of censorship and punishment of political dissent. But here now, what you see is things like social censure, employment blacklisting, harassment, slander, lawsuits, policies of corporations like Facebook and Google being used to intimidate people, to silence them, to have their material removed from view, and rid the world of all these bad thoughts. And they have managed to engage in a lot of governmental and justice systems in these supposedly free societies that we live in. In the UK, a teenage boy was charged with a crime a couple of years ago for calling a police officer's horse gay. And in Toronto, a man's been charged with criminal harassment for tweeting at some women that he disapproved of their actions, which was ironic because their actions were to harass another individual.
One can only conclude when we look at these ideas that the Long March has been a devastating success. Even if a counter march could be launched, and this is very doubtful in that conservative and free-thinking intellectuals just don't tend to conduct ruthless campaigns for intellectual dominance. We're looking at a decades-long struggle to return integrity to our universities with certainly no sure victory.
This discussion, PC versus respectful speaking and listening, I'm going to assert there's no choice between the one or the other. They don't even have anything to do with each other. In my experience as a mostly respectful heretic, the PC police don't seem to much care how respectfully you speak, how politely you listen.
According to a 2014 study by 2 Indiana University professors, reporters who identify as Democrats outnumber those who identify as Republicans by 4-1, 28% to 7%. The remaining 65% call themselves independent, but based on my long experience as a reporter, this is a fiction. That is, many reporters like to describe themselves as independent, but they're not. Not really. By any fair measure, this group is overwhelmingly on the political left. The obvious liberal bias has only served to push conservative readers to those sources that cater to conservative themes, further polarizing the media landscape. And unable to attract conservatives, the mainstream media have chosen to double down on views and themes that appeal to their liberal constituency. To give just one example, when Fox News broke a story in January 2016 about the discovery of top-secret intelligence on the private email server that Hillary Clinton used while Secretary of State, classified information which she had denied ever having sent or received, the New York Times buried this news story deep inside the paper. A decline in reporting standards, a decline in revenue, an increase in bias have made many wary of the people who provide them with their news. A certain amount of skepticism is a healthy thing, but a thriving democracy depends on a dynamic and free press. As much as people may like to bash the media, most people would far prefer to trust it.